We need people to think about what's possible and explore applications that have not been built yet.
I think the holy grail of the future really is, in my lifetime, nuclear thermal propulsion.
And the only way the science fiction future happens is if we make it happen.
All right. Well, welcome to episode 2 of the Long Frontier podcast. And I am so excited today for this topic about biological computers. So, big headline number, brain only runs on 20 watts of power. Data center runs on tens or hundreds of megawatts on power. A 3-year-old recognizes a cat from just a few images. An AI model needs tens of thousands of images. So you see, there is a disparity between the way that our biological processors work compared to what we've done in silicon. And some people are working to close that gap, and for good reason, because it's that much more efficient. So that's exactly what I'm excited to talk about today, is people who are not just trying to imitate the brain and on silicon, but actually use human brain components or animal brain components to take advantage of that fundamental processing advantages. Great. So Abe, I know you've been thinking about this for a lot longer than I have and have some background in it. So would love if you could just start off by giving us a little bit of history and context for how we even got to this point.
You got it. And before I dig in on the history, I always love to start with science fiction. And honestly, that's why I'm here. I just want to live in the future I dreamed of. And so let's paint a picture. Today, we imagine data centers everywhere, and they're full of chips, NVIDIA, other new inference chips, et cetera. It's still just silicon, a bunch of electricity going in and heat pouring out. And that's what we all understand the future of AI data centers to be. But what if they were full of biological neural nets, actual brain pieces running on chips, doing all of this faster, better, smarter, fundamentally differently? Nobody's thinking those thoughts except our guest. So we will welcome Han in a bit. But first, I want to dig into how we even got here as humanity, because it didn't happen yesterday, didn't happen in the last decade or two. People have been at this for over 100 years. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll actually go get schooled by the expert. I'll try to make it fun for the family. If I tell the story in too detailed a way, it's not, but you can go to Wikipedia and have a good time. But actually, for me, it starts with the science fiction I read as a kid, right? Anne McCaffrey told me that in the future, brains would be able to fly spaceships all around up in space. And hey, I want to live in that world to some extent. And they control space stations, and we'd have, robots that have brains that are positronic and or, combinations of computer and biology. And all of that felt like science fiction until I had a chat with my friend Han 4 years ago when I got into deep tech. So Han is building biological computers. I guarantee he's going to blow your mind. Brannon, you haven't really met him yet. So for me, this is fun because I'm going to watch in real time as you learn a bit about this.
Right.
But humans have been thinking about this for a while. So going back to 1818, when Frankenstein comes out, and we understand that you've got to take this brain and put it inside of Frankenstein and shove some electricity in there, and then maybe some magic will happen. All the way to 1857 in Paris, a French physician starts asking the question, can we keep a brain going in the absence of its body? And he does, right? And so people are really trying to work on and understand this. In the early 1920s, we get the first electrical measurements out of the brain. We understand that actually there's electrical computation going on in there, or at least electrical signals. And remember, we don't have computers back then. We just have science, right? We have measurement devices and so on. So that was really the start of saying, what is happening in here? And then you talked about cats, right? So in 1947, we were able to isolate and get into the cerebral circulation of a cat and start paying more attention to what's going on inside the brain. But this is still in the context of the animals themselves, because we can't operate at a level smaller or simpler than that.
And just a question, is this all being driven by academia at the time? Certainly there's no commercial applications, I imagine, but probably not even, people aren't even really doing it in medicine at this time. This is just academics doing this?
Absolutely. So these are academics who are coming out of, medical schools, biology and so on, as people who are at that combination of what's new in technology and ability to measure with electronics, but also understand the physiology of the world and so on. So laboratory experiments and yes, academia. And, the joke is always every overnight success was 10 years in the making. This one's been, pushing 200 years in the making. People have been working this problem for a long time. And you go back to the greats, people have been wondering what's happening in our brains. So probably millennia in the making. But it wasn't really until the 1980s, 1970s when you had some better EEG chips, 1980s when computers started happening and we started thinking about neuromorphic engineering, understanding what's going on in these transistors we were inventing and trying to map those to some of the neurons that we were understanding were in our brain, and on and on. So in the 90s and the 2000s, people started trying to understand what's going on in an actual biological neuron with some of these chips. We finally had chips that could let us measure them and see what's going on, but it was still so nascent and so imperfect that nothing really happened. But they were able to get rat neurons to connect robot bodies. That's in the 1990s and the 2000s. So you're starting to see maybe there's something here. Maybe we can do something. But it was always, like I said, a hard ride on the tech tree, not something that you'd read about all the time or see going on. Yeah.
When did stem cell organoid scientific development really start to become a breakthrough? Because I feel like it's only been the last 15 years, maybe 20 years, 2006 onward, where foundational stem cell discoveries have really started to come to bear, the creation of complex 3D human tissue models and other things. That to me feels like something that is enabling biological computation that wasn't possible for all of modern history, even though people have been thinking about it a long time.
Yes. I mean, fundamentally, this could not have happened until recently, and we're just at the start of figuring out how far it can go. So we're going to have a really great conversation today with my friend Hon. He's visiting from Australia, and he is building a biological computer, and he is doing that by growing neurons and putting them on chips. And this was not possible until, we had that stem cell research. We had the ability to grow and keep alive, a bed of neurons. We understood how to take mouse brains and perturb them and understand them and transform them. That's all pretty recent, within the last decade or so. So it's truly hot off the press. And the progress he's made since I first talked to him 4 years ago and today is already incredible. So we're going to have a great conversation. So with that, we're excited to welcome my friend Hon today, who's the CEO and founder of Cortical Labs and actually knows what he's talking about in the space. So Hon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Abe, and Brannon, for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I met so long ago. I'm embarrassed to admit it. You were much younger then. I was still old. We met down in New York. I was running Google research. You came in, hanging out with some of our sharp young folks, and I remember that meeting. And we kind of vaguely kept in touch. And when I got back into deep tech investing, you immediately reached out and said, "I've got to show you what I'm building." We had a conversation and you blew my mind. So I've wanted to do this for a long time. I just thought, it's pretty special. I got to see what you're doing and I want to share it with the world.
I think, it was when I reached out to you just as the paper came out in 2022, but a lot has evolved since. And, it's still evolving because it's one of those very new frontier spaces. So I'm really glad that, I'm on the show and having the ability to share some of the stories with you and some of my thinking about where this will go.
Yeah. And we've kind of teased a little bit before we showed up and brought you in, but, really this is the meat of it is you are building a biological computer. And most people don't even know that's happening. Everybody's talking about AI. They're thinking about NVIDIA chips and big data centers and so on. So I'd love you to just start with the high level overview. What are you even doing? And tell us about it. Because, that will frame the whole conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think where I'd like to start really is how I really got into the space. And this was way back in sort of 2017, 2018. I've been doing machine learning all the way back since 2015, 2016. And I wanted to do something in that space. But there were a lot of, convolutional neural network X startups and, a lot of people doing the same thing. But I figured I wanted to do something else that was a little bit different, a little bit more exotic. So I went back into the literature and I came across a paper written by Demis Hassabis from DeepMind. And he called for machine learning and AI people to return to our roots in neuroscience because that's where all the initial discoveries were made. So I took that advice literally to heart and I went to the neuroscience department at the University of Melbourne, which is my alma mater. And I said, guys, I read Demis's paper. I'm here for machine learning land. Well, I also was a medical doctor, and said, I want to know what are the most exciting things and interesting things that you're working on. So we went through a list of things, and the thing that caught my attention was from the guys doing electrophysiology. So electrophysiology, for those of you who don't know, is the study of the electro properties of neurons. And it's really important, particularly for diseases like epilepsy, right? Where there is an over hyperactivity of the neurons and you end up with seizures. And so, delving deeper into what they were doing, I had discovered that they had a machine called a microelectrode array. And by no means this is a new technology, it's been around since the early 2000s, where you could grow living neurons on this chip and read the electrical activity from these neurons and also occasionally stimulate them, give them a bit of an electrical impulse. And what was really interesting about that was I got curious and I delved a little bit deeper and I said, so where do you guys get these neurons from? And they explained to me that the neurons came from mice. And they would go through this process of finding a mouse that has a disease state that's similar to human. They would then chop the heads, so decapitate them, remove the brains, remove the meninges, which is the covering that keeps the brain enwrapped. And then if you take trypsin, which is a peptide that dissolves the connective tissue, and you just put the brain inside and shake it around, the connective tissue dissolves and the neurons they lose their structure and they become neurons again. So you would then take those neurons in a pipette and put them on the microelectrode array, and they will, through replenishment with cell culture media, reform neural networks onto that surface. Now, the really interesting thing for me in that whole process was working the steps of how we got there and doing some hypothetical deductive reasoning, which is had we not done this gruesome decapitation and turning the brain back into neurons, a brain, even a mouse brain, can do intelligence. And if intelligence today we believe is a form of compute, therefore these neurons could potentially also do compute on the chip. But the question is, why has anyone not really looked into this space? And then I said, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually show that these neurons outside of a body, outside of its natural state as a brain, could also possess the basic properties for compute and recapitulate them in a synthetic sort of setting. So that's how Cortical Labs was born. Really was us trying to say, can you get these neurons to do something interesting outside of a body? And the simplest way to summarize it is if Neuralink, and everyone knows that company, is trying to put a chip inside a brain, we're doing the opposite. We start with the chip and we grow the brain on top of it.
Yeah, and Han, I jumped right into it because that really is the mind-blowing. Anybody who doesn't know what you're doing hears that story and thinks about the world differently than they did before. So I love that. But you glossed over so much of the, so I looked into the space. So I played with these chips. So I read all the literature. So I was, checking out what Demis was doing over at DeepMind. What made you the person who could see all of these things and combine them and go actually make it happen? What brought you to that space, right? Give us a little bit of the Han backstory.
So the story of how Cortical Labs really became a thing was initially I caught up with an old friend who was the founding partner of a very large Australian venture capital fund called Blackbird Ventures. This is Nick Kiskevak, and over coffee, he's like, yeah, I see you've exited Clinical Cloud. What are you doing these days? So I was like, oh, I'm doing a bunch of things. And I have an idea. I told him, I think I can get like neurons outside of a body to compute. And he said, oh, this sounds pretty cool. Here you go, take $1 million Australian and see how far you get with this. So I did that. And I built a lab, hired a bunch of people. And, the question was, what are we going to do to actually show that this thing can do anything? And again, history provides the guide. And if you roll back and you look at what the first thing Demis tried to do was he tried to get the machine to play Pong. And we said, why don't we just do the same thing that DeepMind did and try to get the neurons to play Pong? So that became, the major focus. And then we managed to get the publication out in the Journal of Neuron in 2022 that proved that these neurons could actually play Pong. They were not perfect. They were actually kind of crap, but the limitations we had made it actually very difficult for the neurons to play. But what was really interesting was because we did so much rigor, we had such strong statistical significance that it was absolutely not by chance that something was actually happening as a learning effect.
I mean, that's amazing. And your 2022 Pong demonstration really created a lot of waves. And you saw that you can actually train these human neurons to learn. I think my first question I'd love to ask as we sort of dig into the tech is it learning in the way that human neurons currently learn? Is the mechanism the same for how they internalize knowledge and then we're able to use it to do Pong? Or is there something fundamentally different that's happening there?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with the first point. It is closer. We don't know for certain if it's exactly the same thing that's happening in our brains or a brain of a dog. But one thing for certain is that it is closer to how our brains or a dog brain is working than a machine learning model. The reason why I say this is that as part of the process of trying to get Pong to work, we were like, how are we going to train this and so forth? And then we realized that reinforcement learning might actually be a very good paradigm for doing this. And the reinforcement learning that we do is actually quite different from your traditional RL systems where, you still have a forward pass and a back propagation, and your reward policy is actually the one that's driving the loss function. In our system, there is no training or inference. It's only one inferential phase. And as part of the inferential loop, you're reinforcing the positive outcome or you're doing a positive or negative reinforcement for the outcomes that you're seeking. And so this is actually closest to say, if you have a dog, training it to do a trick, right? Because how you have to train a dog to do a trick is you start with the treat or you start with something, and then you try to randomly get it to do the desired action. So let's say you're trying to get paw, right? Or something like that. So you put the treat in your hand and it tries to reach out. And every time it reaches out, you give it the treat. So it then reinforces the behavior that every time you put your hand out, it's going to put its paw out. So the way we train our system is very similar to that. So what we do is whenever, in the case of Pong, whenever the ball is going to move to intercept, when the paddle moves to intercept the ball and it hits the paddle, we reward it, right? Because that's the desired outcome. And every time it does the wrong thing, we kind of, disincentivize or punish it. And the way we figured out how to do this is by modulating the overall information entropy of the system. But that's kind of like, short answer is, yeah, it is closer to how we're working because there is no training and inference.
I mean, and that's awesome. And the reason why I was asking that question in the first place, which you started to answer here, is it feels extensible to what we would imagine the benefits of having biological tissue as a computer could be, which is, I mean, everyone talks about the brain is only 20 watts. There's 86 billion neurons, though, much more compute dense than anything we're doing in a data center. And even what you're describing here seems to start to hint at that possibility. So would love to learn a little bit more about what are some of in your mind, what would be the power that your system would run on? What would be the compute density? In what ways can it push forward the architecture for the future of compute? It sounds like you're already starting to replicate those biological mechanisms that show natural advantages.
Yeah, 100%. So let's break it down into two things. So, and again, this is what's really interesting about the space. Like the second one, we kind of only figured out later into the piece, right? Because it took a little bit of mental gymnastics to understand this. But the energy one is kind of obvious to us. As you said, brain only uses 20 watts. We're using a tiny slice of neurons to do this compute. And so it was kind of interesting for us to just do a back on the envelope calculation, say how much is this thing actually consuming? And what we did, and again, it's also a massive overestimation. We said, how often are we changing the cell culture media? So that becomes, the amount of media that we're using. And then we said, what is the concentration of glucose, assuming that glucose is the primary fuel source in those cell culture media. So if you know what the concentration is, you can work backwards. You can figure out how many moles of glucose there is, and assuming complete combustion of those glucose, given the number of neurons, you can actually work out what the energy consumption is because we're changing it over time. So the number we arrived is actually 10 to the minus 4 to minus 5 watts of energy, biochemical glucose energy, for 800,000 neurons. Now, that is also probably a massive overestimation. It could actually even be close to 10 minus 6 or 7, because we're a little bit wasteful with our cell culture media, to be frank.
And so how does that compare if you scale it up to like human brain numbers of neurons? Are you off by an order of 10 or 2x? Like,
Yeah.
Are you approaching theoretical maximum on neurological neuron energy usage?
Well, I think we're actually quite close to what the physiological energy usage is. But having said that, I mean, for how many neurons we have, we're actually using far less energy in our actual brains, right? And I think because ultimately, and I think this is one of the most important things to understand about biology, is that in biological systems, you cannot expand more energy than you can consume. If you do, that's called death. And if you have death, you get limited in the gene pool, and you do not pass on genes that we see today. And so the brain essentially is very energy efficient. A lot of the times, our neurons are not really doing anything, right? They're resting and only get activated when we have to do stuff. And a lot of the information processing that we observe that is happening is really an energy saving hack. So, for instance, it's well known in, say, neuromorphic computing, or actually even in, say, the neuroscience experiments that were done by Hubert and Wiesel that informed convolutional neural nets. For those of you who don't know, back I think in the 60s or 70s, a couple of researchers got a mouse, they anesthetized it, so it was still, but they kept the eyes moving, and then they plugged in electrodes into the visual cortex and measured the electrical activity. And it turns out that if you look at a blank wall, your neurons are actually not firing at all. And it only starts to fire when it sees contrast, like lines coming through and shapes and so forth. But even then, if you actually just have a straight line and you're not moving it, the neurons actually don't fire at all.
So we have event cameras in here.
Exactly. Yeah, we have event cameras. And this is so different from how, let's say you're doing image processing, like a ConvNet or even, our VLA models today. You're processing every pixel, even though it may be a completely blank pixel, which is a massive waste of energy and compute. And so, there's a lot of interesting observations of that. And so one of the things that drove the information entropy push and pull system that we use for getting Pong to work and also in the Doom stuff is inspired by the entropy principle that Carl describes as biological systems having as being Bayesian generative machines. What it means is that biological systems, including neurons in the brain, have a internal prior distribution, a belief of an external world that's separated by a Markov blanket. And the external world, the real world, has its distributions of its own. And what the biological systems are trying to do is remove or reduce the amount of information surprise. So you can think of it as like one distribution here, which is the belief of the neurons, and one distribution here being the real world. And if you can actually reduce the amount of information surprise, then just using your internal belief system, you can save a ton of compute because you don't have to compute for things like gravity. You don't have to compute for things like air and so forth.
That's fascinating. And I have read and seen how your brain can imagine and see things that aren't actually there. It will start to assume and fill in the rest of your vision in the periphery. So it makes
Yeah.
sense when you think about it as a fundamentally an energy saving mechanism. What it also made me think about is the 20, 30 watts of power that your brain uses. Is that actually an appropriate measurement to say? Because on the other hand, my heart is constantly beating to supply blood to the brain to keep the cells, keep the neurons alive. There's a lot of life support energy that my body is using all the time to allow the 30 watts to basically do the inference and use the own model of the world. Is there a similar analog to what you are doing, or could you think you could get it down to purely 30 watts? Is there some amount of energy you need to put into keeping the cells alive that make it a higher number? But pretty curious to hear what is the constraint or the boundary you think you would get to in terms of energy consumption?
So I think, ultimately, like all, as you're saying, these life support systems, like the heart and the kidneys and all that stuff, and the lungs, are actually in service to maintain homeostasis, right? And, you've probably heard of this term, the primordial soup, right? Kind of thing. And what is really interesting, like, you go back into like cell biology and you look at embryology and so forth, is that every one of us is carrying primordial soup in us, right? And that is in our brains, the CSF, the plasma, and the primordial soup that we carry today. There's some thinking that it's the plasma and the CSF that we have is very similar to how cells evolved way back when life started to emerge, right? And it's very well controlled. So, for instance, you have 140 millimoles of like sodium, or X amount of, I think 5 millimoles of potassium, and so forth. It's the same thing that you get when you get like a blood test and you get all the electrolyte readings. Um, all of the things that we have, all these life support, is really as a way for us to live on land in environments that are deviating from that primordial soup. So, assuming that you had a primordial soup, you don't actually need any of these life support systems because it would just be very happy in that kind of, homeostatic, like electrolyte, oxygen
Yeah.
sort of like balance environment.
So Han, you kind of blew my mind a little bit more, and this is what's
Yeah.
fun about going in depth here. You point out that my brain cells are lazy and probably lazier than most of yours, but they're sitting around here trying to be efficient, which makes me ask the question: do we think we can overclock your little, neural dishes? Can we ask them to do more? Because probably these things are trying not to do more. Have you explored that at all?
So we haven't done it yet, but there is some ideas that we're throwing around the lab, such as what if we actually not overclock them by using drugs and so on, but very simply actually calorically restricting them. So forcing them to work harder with less energy, and that we would think that might actually cause them to compute harder because you're now put into a survival setting. And we're most dangerous when we're like hungry or like in a terrifying situation.
That makes me wonder about having just read the book After, which kind of asks the question of what happens when you approach brain death. Maybe you're effectively pushing this neural substrate towards some quick computation towards the end to do more. So stepping back, this is truly mind-blowing. It's science fiction, except you've made it real, and that's really what we're about. When you started on this path, aside from your having been early doing the uncool things because you were into them and curious, and like all of that combined into you built a medical device company, it won early, and now you're building these, brain chips. Were you thinking this is the way that the future should compute, or were you thinking this is a possibility and we should explore it? How prescient were you about where this all might be? And talk to us about what you see the world turning into as technologies like these become more possible.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, the typical like founder BS story is always like, yes, I knew exactly what was going to happen and I could see the future kind of thing. To be fair, like I don't think that's usually the case, or at least for me. It's always a matter of let's see where we can go in 6 months or 8 months, and we'll reassess it, right? So I never really thought that this was going to be like, hey, it's going to completely change computing or whatever. It was, initially started with, let's see how far we can get with this. Can we even get it to work? Oh, it got it to work. What's interesting about it? Oh, it uses very little energy. Oh, it uses very little data. Oh, it's running in real time. And all the things that we start to learn, it then, formulates into, well, there are some properties that we see in this thing that would be very useful to solve for challenges that we have today. But the other thing I think is really important is to have intellectual humility and to understand that we are building things today based on the priors that we're observing right now. And a lot of the times, discoveries are serendipitous. Like I always talk about AlexNet, right? Because I think that was the defining moment in the whole AI story. Um, and a lot of people don't actually remember or understand how we got here, right? But maybe I'm sure you're familiar, and maybe Brandon as well, right? Like the story of NVIDIA and where it's at today, I think it's 100% an accident. It was a fluke, right? Because if Jensen was so sure about AI, he wouldn't have wasted 7 years when CUDA was released to getting AlexNet to work, right? He would have gone straight to Jeff and said, hey, I built you something for your CompNets to work. But instead, it took 7 years. And it was pure accident, I think, that, Alex Krzyzewski was Jeff Hinton's student, was working on ImageNet, had a GPU and knew how to write CUDA. And all of these four things, mixed together, and you get this like awesome suit that was like AlexNet that came out from it. And AlexNet was really what kicked off the whole like neural net, R&D like surge that eventually leads us to where we are today. So again, I think for us, it's really saying we know what these things are good for. We know people who want to use this. Let's give it to them and let's see how they'll, use this. And maybe we get somewhere, maybe we don't, right? And I think it's a little bit too early for us to say where this is going to go, except for let's hope that it helps people solve their problems.
And I love that approach because that is the way that human innovation has been done for all of humanity, actually. Is,
Yeah.
hey, here's this new thing. Let me see what I can do with it. Let me play with it. Let me start to give it to other people. And then new applications begin to emerge. So I totally buy that for this as well. Now, the question I do want to ask is kind of the flip side of that. What do you think are going to be the hardest technical or commercial barriers to overcome? When I think about silicon, right, we learned how to mass manufacture that. I imagine there's probably some scalability challenges with biological compute. There are probably other challenges. When you're looking forward to this future, where do you think the biggest challenges are remaining?
Yeah, I think we're only just getting started. There are so many like challenges, right? So, for instance, memory. Everyone asks us this question of like, what happens when they die? And we go, well, they die, right? And they just lose their memories, kind of thing. Just like in reality, like how humans or even a dog or a cat will do. And so, trying to solve for that is a humongous challenge. Like we don't even understand how memory works, right? Even in the brain. But we're working on some ideas, and I think now that we have a platform where we can actually grow hippocampal neurons, which is responsible for new memory, and work on these things, we'll have a better idea, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years of where memory exists. And I'm hoping that more people will come on board and experiment and share their findings, because that way it's not all on to us, but up to our colleagues in the research and academic space. So memory is a huge problem. It's offset by the fact that these systems learn pretty quickly, so you can always just retrain them if they die on a new batch. The other one that may be a problem is variability and stochasticity. So in silicon, there's always some variability, and we bin our chips accordingly. But when you get a chip, it's relatively deterministic, right? You buy a chip that says, I'm going to get you to 4.8 gigahertz. Cool. You most likely will get to 4.8 gigahertz. Having said that, what the vendors don't tell you, and that's where in the overclocking community, people just love doing this stuff, is that 4.8 is usually a safe number that they just use. you can probably go up to like, 5.2, depending on like the silicon lottery that you get. So in the silicon industry, because it's had 70 years of like figuring out how to do this, they've come up with a way of getting some level of determinism with that. Our system, I can tell you for a fact that 100 questions people ask me is like, do different people have different cells performance? And the answer is yes, because even within the same person, we get variability in cell performance, even though we try to control for as many factors, which is also a very interesting question. Like, why do some cells perform better than others, even though we control for all the as many factors as we can, and they're of the same genotype? We think there's some sort of like environmental gene expression thing that comes in that confers better performance versus low performance. But that's also a really interesting question then, because if you can figure out what the gene expressions are, could you reverse engineer that to
Exactly.
naturally overclock them, right? And maybe come up with therapy that
Make
gives
some
us
that are
all
even better over time. Yeah.
Hey,
correct. Yeah.
Han, I'm full of questions here. One
Yeah.
specific question and then a bigger question. So the specific question is, we're struggling with understanding deep neural nets, what they do, the LLMs, predictability, but still you can kind of view them as stochastic, like a machine. You can
Mhm.
mostly understand what they're doing from a math perspective. And yet, in theory, humans with our neural nets, wetware version, we have free will and we can choose things. Do you see any kind of unreliability out of your wetware neural nets that suggests that there's an animal in there or like something that's not quite so mechanical? Or are these
Yeah.
just, sufficiently small slices that they do behave quite mechanically?
Um, um, yes and no. So they're small enough that we can control for that. But what we also observe, I mean, it's having said that, I mean, if you think about training neural nets, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't publish, is that you get different results in the early phases depending on your random seed, right? So there's that, gradient descent pathway that they can take, right? And what we usually publish is like, oh yeah, we got to this point and it's like, state of the art and move on from there because we can freeze the weights. The neurons can actually kind of do the similar thing as well, where they kind of like in the early training phases will meander a little bit and some will actually purposely get worse before they get better, which is something that we also see in RL, right? Like we see a drop in performance as they're exploring the system, and then they go, okay, now I need to start exploiting it. Um, so I don't think we actually have systems that have that kind of like free will or consciousness kind of thing, which is, for us, a bioethical sort of like red line that we don't really want to cross. And for us, it's all about, can we exploit them for, up to the point of sentience, right? Where you can
Yeah.
give them information, they'll process it, and then they'll do something with that information.
And that becomes an interesting conversation in itself. And we really don't know, like, when does sentience start? What is the size of the network, et cetera?
Correct.
And what you said earlier about memory is fascinating too, because to some extent, you might be able to answer questions about how memory forms in neurons that other people can't as you build these to scale and just pay attention to them. But my bigger question was, I love the humility of, we'll go 6 months at a time. We'll keep pushing the frontier out. It's impossible until it's not. So it's hard to dream much further than the edge of the unknown. But
Yep.
like, I would say when I was at Google Research, that's how we approached 10-year problems. As we said, show me value every year, right? And maybe we'll keep going. And Google has accomplished some pretty phenomenal 10-year research outcomes doing these things, one, roof shot at a time, if you follow that language. So as you imagine where this goes, and you imagine that every 6 months you just keep pushing the frontier out, what do you think the world looks like 5 years from now, 15 years from now? Like, just keep thinking further, assuming that we solve these problems and keep answering the next question. Paint a picture of the future for us where Han pioneered biological compute and your colleagues playing this game do as well. Where do we get?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are going to be maybe two or three things that I think will happen. Firstly, we didn't really touch much on this, but one of the things that we recently have learned about these neurons is that they are highly sample efficient. And it's funny because nobody's talking about sample efficiency, but it's absolutely critical. And I guess you guys know this because you're roboticists, right? That robots are embodying the real world, right? And the real world ticks at the same clock speed as everyone in this environment. What that means is that you can't sit here and sample 1,000 samples to make a decision what to do. Your system has to be online learning. And we see this with the neurons. They're actually online learning because they're embodied in the real world, like you and I. And what I think is going to happen is that this is going to really enable robotics, physical AI systems, real-time systems where there are no pre-training data sets. And even if we did have pre-training data sets, the question that always remains is what is the delta between the simulation or the pre-training versus real world, right? It's the sim to real problem. Um, that that's the first thing we're going to see a lot of systems emerge that will be more autonomous, that will make decisions on the fly. They may not have super intelligence. They won't be able to answer the stuff that ChatGPT is doing, but they will be able to be more dynamic and adapt to new environments. The second thing as well is assuming that these things end up in compute data centers and so forth. We will see a massive reduction in the amount of required energy and compute required to solve for, I think, physical AI systems. Because right now, I think it is going to take, assuming that we're still on the same architectures and the same models, language is doable because I think it's a unidirectional, one-dimensional problem, right? Your sentence is going from left to right, and you're predicting the next token. I mean, there's a lot more stuff happening, but that's the basic gist of it. But if you think about if you're a robotic joint, now you have a bigger problem set because you have to predict where you will be in bidirectional three axes of dimensionality, plus also a unidimensionality of time. So the amount of compute you're going to have to do for that, it increases tremendously. I think these biological systems will actually be very good at doing that at that very low energy requirement, which will be better for the environment, I think, because right now there's all this talk about data centers sucking up all the water for communities, and people are not happy about that. And one of the more I think interesting things is something that we've been talking with our data center partners is, what if you actually built a lab on site of the data center that you would house these units, right? Now, what you've actually done is you've decoupled your data center operations from a supply chain requirement, which is you are going to have to buy chips from one source, which is NVIDIA TSMC in Taiwan. But if you start making them on site, your data center also becomes the factory, and it completely decentralizes that hard central requirement, and anyone can just start making their own compute units, and that completely
You
changes
literally
the
grow your
landscape.
own compute chips.
Correct, exactly,
Yep.
on site.
Well, one, I love what you were saying about the real-time dynamicism and ability to just interact with the real world, the small sample rate.
Yeah.
Because you think about a fruit fly buzzing around, your bananas. It can evade you. It can move around. It can get to the banana. It's not going to help you with your math or philosophy homework, to your point. But in real time, it can make those kinds of decisions. And that's exactly what we need at the edge for embodied AI. So it feels like fundamentally quite a compelling platform. And then I love the point about manufacturing. And one question that I just wanted to ask first on this is, if you are growing the neurons in a lab, are you able to control some of the properties? Could you then have some uniformity in performance or leverage that to get ideal performance out of it?
I think this is where the two paths diverge, right? So, in academia right now, particularly in the synthetic biology space, the hot topic is organoids. Can we grow mini brains that resemble embryonic development, so you get all the different cell types, right? Because they're trying to come up with disease models, and you need a lot of that heterogeneity that comes into it. If you're trying to do compute, you're actually trying to solve a different problem, which is you don't want heterogeneity, you want homogeneity of your cell types.
Yes.
And so, if you're growing in a lab and you say, we don't want to recapitulate brains as organoids, but we just want to grow them as compute units, there are many different ways and techniques to make them more deterministic, make them more uniform. So yeah, from a industrial perspective, from what is it, engineered biology, that's something that is, quite achievable.
And you brought up the concept of organoids. Maybe give us just a layout of who else is playing with biological compute today. What are the different edges of the frontier being explored? And what are some of the predicate technologies that maybe didn't exist until you got started in the early 2010s? This was not possible. What had to exist to unlock this? And do you see developments down other technology paths that will help you go faster. So kind of just paint the picture and almost a, speed run. Here's what else is going on. Here's what unlocked this all. Here's what we're eagerly waiting for to help us go even faster. And here's what is unsolved. And we wish somebody would build this technology so we could build the, data center full of tiny little, brain chips.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the vast majority of the work in this space is still in academia. There are a few startups I'll mention as well. So in academia, we have University of Illinois, who have their own program. UC Santa Barbara's got their own program as well. Johns Hopkins has an organoid intelligence group that we're kind of part of as well. So there's a whole bunch of people already doing this. We have colleagues in Japan, University of Sendai, and the Italians have their own program. So a lot of the academics are kind of working on this. There are several startups that I'll mention. So there's a company called Final Spark that are also trying to do biological computers, but mostly in the cloud only. There's also a company in San Francisco doing called the Biological Computing Company. They're more focused on trying to come up with the algorithms to solve for AGI and so forth. Where we sit in this space is we say we love everybody in this space. We want to support you, so please come and use our API and SDK, use our cloud, or use our machine that you can get for your lab. So that's kind of the landscape of who's playing in the sandpit right now. We'll find out more because there's actually, I think it's due next week, a DARPA grand challenge called the O Circuit Challenge that just got announced at the start of May that actually talks about, Brannon, your point of the fruit fly, right? They said exactly the same thing. How is it a fly uses so little energy and is flying better than any of our drones? So that is now a DARPA grand challenge. And so we'll find out who else is working on this space as, the honeypot is laid out. And, some of the technologies that didn't exist, for instance, commercially available like FPGA units, we use a Xilinx module that's really useful for us to do the signal processing and so forth. The ultra low voltage ADC DACs that we use that kind of also are powering the things that Neuralink and Synchron are using in the BCI space. So we're technically the other side of BCI. So we leverage a lot of technologies that have been developed for other industries, and we kind of integrate them to solve for the problem. And I think going into the future, we'll have more technologies that come out for instance, multimodality. So right now we're using electrical for both read and stim. Why not use an optical system to reduce the load on one, so you can say read with optical, stim with electrical, smaller systems, more robust systems, better API and SDKs to program them, new materials. So, looking at graphene, three-dimensional lattice structures to get you more data in. So these are all, coming in the pipeline. But ultimately, I think it's really back to the developers and the researchers, to flex their creative spirit and help us and help inform us, where do they want to go? What's the thing that they need most, kind of thing.
I love your point about BCI as well and how you've leveraged technology from them. And we've been talking a bunch about brain-computer interfaces in general. And it made me want to ask the other question, which is, are you also building a new set of tools and skills that actually BCI needs? Because when you kind of think about it, the biggest issue with any good brain-computer interface is access to the neural activity. You could create synthetic version of that access on an infinite substrate if you wanted to, that would functionally be the data farming platform for brain-computer interface. You could put all kinds of chips on there, you could learn how neurons fire, and it might provide enough data that the BCI companies actually can start to read what's going on with better fidelity, or they realize patterns they didn't know. So it made me start to think about how you can actually elevate that industry too, and that dynamic interplay. I'm just curious if that has started to come up for you.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we kind of I guess so there is actually a very interesting pattern that is under dispute that was, I think, written up when Max Rodak was still a co-founder at Neuralink, but he's kind of moved on to science now. But Neuralink has this pattern where instead of putting the electrodes directly into the brain, they grow a layer of neurons on the electrode, train them to do stuff, and then reintegrate the neurons back into the brain so you have minimal trauma. We're not doing that bit, so I think we're okay with that pattern. But what's interesting is nobody's really looking into how do you train them apart from us. And when you solve for that, you actually solve for the other side of the BCI problem, which is writing information, because all BCIs today are read only.
Sure.
The holy grail is always the I know kung fu, right, in the Matrix scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Magically teach me what I don't yet know. So,
Correct.
Han, I could talk to you literally for the rest of the day. It's like just so much fun. But I know you actually have one of these units at hand. So I think before we
Yeah.
let you go, do you just want to do a little show and tell? Because we're talking theoretical and, people can see this on the internet, but this is real. So kind of walk us through what this is.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to plug them in. So usually it depends on, this is a touchscreen interface. And usually we have ports here that will take media in and waste out. So these neurons require regular feeding. So we go on a 48-hour regular schedule to put new fresh media with nutrients, and we take the waste cell culture media out that has a lot of lactic acid and ammonia byproducts. And then I'm going to try and see if I can do this. So I can open up the top. And I'm going to tilt to see. Hold on a sec. I'll move my camera and I'll tilt so you can see the system. So this is, reposition it. Here we go. This is the neural chamber. So neurons would actually sit in this section here. And this is one of the chips that we had neurons growing. I think, no, this is not the one that did do it, but neurons would grow in the center portion here. And there are these tiny
all the leads.
Micron, electrodes that have the leads to the outside. We put them onto this section here that has a heating element. So we keep it at body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. And then these pogo pins make contact with the external pads. And that's how we can read that electrical activity. These tubes here are life support systems. So everything from here onwards is life support to keep the brain alive. So back to, Brannon's point about like the heart and lungs. Yeah, we had to recapitulate all of that. So these are pumps like the heart. This is a feeding. This is a waste reservoir. So you can think of it as the stomach and the bladder. These are filtration units like the kidneys. And you can see there's actually a membrane that's strung in between the two chambers. And we use a countercurrent diffusion process to exchange waste for nutrients. This is a gas mixer. So we can actually mix the gases. Let me see if I can show you the back of the unit.
Is just wild.
Wild.
Yeah.
I've seen the photos. I've heard you talk about it, but even just this tour is a ton of fun. This is a real machine you made.
This is a real machine, and they're actually, I can show you as well. We'll jump into the screen share, but you can put in air. So we don't need any oxygen because air has 20% oxygen at room temperature and at sea level. CO2 is put in to modulate the pH, and nitrogen if we need to drop the oxygen down to 5%, which is what we have in our brains. And we have a outlet valve to relieve the pressure in the gas mixers because there are a bunch of solenoids that mix the gases into the right concentrations. And then we have a typical gigabit Ethernet, USB-A, and USB-C. So we use this primarily for communications and to get data in and out. But then we can also plug in peripherals into the USB ports. So thinking is perhaps we can put cameras or motors or stuff like that in future applications. But I think what is pretty interesting for you guys to check out here.
And for our, listeners, you saw it here first. That's the port in the back of the neck and Neuromancer, just a few generations away from being ready to go.
Yep. So this is a live stream of neural culture on our Cortical Cloud. So we have racks of these units in our lab, and we're growing, neurons for researchers to do work on.
We need to get a picture of that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And then, this is neurons just spontaneously doing their thing. So you can think of this as the surface of that chip. We have, the neurons on them, and every time they're spiking, we're getting, the recordings here being shown. And then these are the vitals, so temperature, CO2, oxygen. You can set the pump speeds. And then you can look at the activity view here. So I don't like the 3D view. Let's do the 2D view. So let's change the scale.
Nuts.
So these are neurons just streaming their neural activity in. And we can also, click to stimulate. So I can stimulate this electrode here, and I've delivered a voltage in. and these guys get really chatty after you
Oh
give them
man.
that.
Okay,
Um,
so I can't let you go as you show me this, and you kind of touched on this earlier. And I love that you're trained as a clinician and you're self-trained as an entrepreneur in all the right places. But the clinician perspective, and this actually came out in a sentence you said about your first paper. It was like statistically robust. You did good research, and you are
yeah.
uniquely suited to do this. My grandfather did the first organ transplant, and when he did that, they went through ethical boards and lots of
Mm,
conversation and discussion about should we even do this, and involved religious leaders and others. And I imagine that
mhm,
you get some variations of these questions and that you do the right thing because of your training.
mm,
And maybe
mhm,
you're just too far away from it. And here's what we would do when we got there. But
yeah.
what is the like quick answer to the ethical question that will always come up when I see these
Yeah.
neurons firing and they're on real neural chips? It's wild.
Yeah, I think ultimately there's this, what is it, an ethical principle of the double doctrine, right? So the question is, why are you doing this, and is there an inherently net good that comes from it, right? And this is the reason why we dropped off a unit at Hopkins and Mass General and also UCSF, because apart from the whole like compute side of things, which is interesting stuff, there is actually real biomedical research happening for disease modeling. And the hope is, so for instance, Rudy Tanzi's lab, he's, a world-renowned researcher into Alzheimer's dementia. And for me, I would love it if he could come up with a cognitive model for an in vitro system that exhibited dementia. Because now you have a mini thing that you can just blast all the drugs, and then you might come with a cure. So I think it's this. Why are we doing this? Is there a net good? Same thing that we're talking about AI today, right? Like people are talking about, it's going to steal jobs and whatever. But the positive outcome is it's potentially going to find the next cure for cancer and so forth.
Yeah.
So that is the whole ethical rationale for it. So yeah, this is them doing their thing. But more interestingly here as well, for most people, maybe some of your audience, is the fact that you can program them. And so here's the Jupyter notebook that's running on the CL1. And essentially, when you're a developer, what you're actually doing is you're building mini matrix environments that the neurons are working in. So yeah, you can go to docs.corticallabs.com, and all the documentation is annotated there.
That's incredible. Well, Han, I love ending with this because it's just real. You walked us through the entire history of how people got here. You made this into a thing people can build and research on and hopefully unlock some scientific advancement.
Yep.
But you can also just write the dang code, which is, the ultimate engineering question of does it work?
Yep.
So, but before we let you go and get back to your busy week, anything you want to leave our audience with, a final thought on where we're all going, or an encouragement to join you in this journey, or anything? Like what's your takeaway?
So I think my takeaway here is there is a lot of doom and gloom in the software engineering developer space. And what I think here is actually, it's not that bad, right? Because there are still so many unsolved problems that we need developers to come on board, because ultimately an LLM can't solve this because they cannot solve for problems they have not seen in their distribution.
Right.
We need people to think about what's possible, encourage them with the creativity and the new tools to explore applications that have not been built yet. And so I'm still on Team Human here, and I think there's a lot we can actually do. We just got to get out of creating the same thing over and over again and start thinking freely again and building new stuff.
We are also Team Human, and we talk
Mm,
all the time about everything remains to be solved still. I love how we spent so much time talking about compute and can it be an analog to semiconductor and silicon, but probably the most profound thing came at the end when you said, we can model dementia. We could model Alzheimer's.
mm,
And then once you know the enemy, you can defeat it.
correct.
I love that. So it is so cool. I'm on Team Human, on sharp people like you to figure this out, to keep pushing the envelope. The world needs it. And we're so grateful that you gave us a glimpse into your world today.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you so much, Han. And we'll let you go.
All right. Bye.
So, Brannon, I'd met Han a long time ago, and we had a crazy chat like 4 years ago. And I promised you that your mind would be blown. I'm just curious, how you feel after having, sat through and listened to that.
As we were preparing and doing our own research, I was mostly aware of kind of the limitations, but I just didn't really see how real it could be. And as he was describing their approach, so many more avenues came clear to me of what the future might look like. If you can actually make this, and I mentioned it before, but if you could make a whole human brain, you can then start to do all the research we would want to do on our own brains. I mean, we talked about diseases, but could you start to understand mental health? Could you start to understand depression? Could you start to understand how psychedelics and medicines interact with your brain and what it does? I think it feels like a fundamental unlock if they can do it. There's many, many challenges, but it feels like it has the potential to revolutionize the way we do medicine and have an understanding of our own bodies. That to me was very cool, especially when he started showing programming. If you can program and distill the difference between someone that's bipolar versus a healthy brain. I mean, those kinds of outcomes to me are fascinating. That was one. And the second piece, outside of the health piece, more the compute side, was it made me, this is a silly idea a little bit, but it made me start to wonder, will the infrastructure around data centers transition from being cooling and power management to life support for the chips, food in, food out, waste in, waste, mixing of gases. And probably that would be less power consumptive than a massive, cooling system for your rack. We didn't ask him about the thermal performance of a compute system like this, but I would be so fascinated to dig into that. So those are some of the things that were on my mind about what the future looks like. What are the second order effects of it too? But truly, truly mind blowing. And I agree. I wasn't ready, which makes me feel like most people are not aware that this is even going on. But what did you think?
I mean, I loved it, and I'd had the conversation before, and I still came up with a bunch of things I didn't know and wanted to pull the thread on, and we probably could have kept Han going for hours and taught everybody more. One that really stuck out was the memory question, right? So as I talked to him about this before, like you can build these neural nets and get them doing things, but they do have a lifespan, and they can only do it for so long. And there are these downsides. But then if they die or like cease to function and you have to build a new one up, how do you answer that question? Well, as he solves questions like that, as you imagine, he just keeps pushing the frontier forward 6 months at a time. To be able to solve the question of how do we understand the memory that formed inside this neural net, this literal, physical, biological neural net, and then measure that, and then ideally generate a new neural net that captures much of that memory. That has huge implications for our understanding of the brain and how the brain functions and how we might interact with the brain. And you and I have been talking about BCI and looking at that space too. I think that this will, inform any future conversation we have around brain-computer interfaces, or even just brain understanding, right? You basically have a little slice of a brain that you can measure, interact with, poke, put signals into. That was a new concept that I haven't bumped into with Han yet.
I like your point about the neurons, because I was actually just trying to think, what's the biological case? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think by and large, you're born with all the neurons you have. There's probably a little bit of neurogenesis and healing and a little bit, but it's not the same as your liver or other things like that. So humans right now, I mean, the neurons I have, they forget a lot of things. So humans right now don't have the most robust memory system. And it makes me think maybe there's a hybridized version where memory is stored, in MRAM, and then you're doing inference really with the biological computer or something. To me, just sounds fascinating.
Yeah. The other part that we didn't have enough time to dig into deep, but is really the question, how are these neural nets behaving differently than the silicon nets that we build? And they are quite different, and they arrive at, answers faster, certainly much cheaper from an energy perspective, but also differently. And, we touched on how that might be useful if you could put it in an edge compute device in a robot. And you and I have talked to other founders who are trying to understand what is going on in the mind of that fruit fly as it navigates this environment. And they're trying to pull those algorithms out and put them into silicon. Well, what if we just kept them in, biology and did it? But then how do you program that? And is there a clock, right? How do you connect that to our world that runs on clocks when we think about silicon and compute? Is it analog thinking? I imagine that you would have to put your mind into a different place to really do everything that's possible with these kinds of biological neural nets. That's just exciting, putting on my computer engineering hat and wanting to write a bunch of code and see what happens.
It feels like there's so much more room for this technology to grow. It feels like this is a long horizon technology, especially when you say that. It made me think, my sister, she's a PhD in neuroscience from UCSF. And her, 7 years of science, she basically came to me and she said, look, we don't know anything about the way our brains work. So the black box question remains for this, just like it does for our LLMs. And when you're talking about that, I'm like, yeah, that it would be where we want to go, but it feels far away. And the last thing we didn't touch on with him, from my perspective, that feels like a barrier is scalability. A life support system for millions, billion, I guess we got 86 billion going on in here, but billions of these things would be pretty challenging. How do you mass manufacture these? How do you do it at a price point that actually makes sense? Because, maybe you save money on power, but actually the cost of compute then is driven by your supply chain if you can't actually make these things. So definitely trade-offs to think about, but clearly there are sharp people on it figuring it out.
Yeah, and when I first met him, he just had, a box or two. Now he's got a rack of them. We've got research centers are getting these and using them. So it's already pushing forward what's possible in terms of the exploration. So when we told our audience that we'd be talking about things that might come in 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, I think we're delivering with this one. Watch this space. Clearly progress is happening, will continue to happen. And this is part of the future. We just can't quite tell how or what yet, but we know it will be. So bunch of fun to have dug in.
Thanks, Abe. Thanks for bringing them on. And thank you everyone for listening. That's a good episode.
And we'll be back for more on The Long Frontier.